Welcome to this live cast on our future economies. Capitalism, despite the tremendous increase in worldwide welfare through its innovative power and freedom, has at the same time a number of negative consequences. A transition is necessary to overcome ecological destruction, decrease in quality of life, and growing inequality. Given geopolitical developments, Europe has an important role to play in this transition. In the livecasts, we will start an open dialogue and discuss this transition with internationally renowned economists from all over the world. Questions will pass by, such as: each week, we will discuss these matters with 2 economists, resulting in 10 online dialogues in 10 weeks, where we will share viewpoints and collect ideas on how capitalism's innovative and creative powers can go hand in hand with fostering an equal and just society. A different subject every week. Together we can build a basis for economies that are beneficial to all of us. You can participate by putting your questions and remarks in the chat. So, let's talk.
Yeah, good evening everybody and welcome to the 4th edition of the series The Future of Capitalism. And today we're going to talk about the effects of contemporary economics on everyday life. Because as we all know, employment is in transition. The platform economy, we have already talked about that in previous editions, has enforced more independent entrepreneurships, flexible contracts than we've ever seen. And income equality is growing. Taxation systems reward those with capital and are excessive, asking the workers to pay up, resulting in a loop of the rich to get richer and the poor to stay where they are. Simultaneously, housing markets are increasingly under pressure. Subsidized housing systems seem no longer to suffice in ensuring affordable housing for everyone. Now, how to overcome the insecurities for people that come along with these developments? How can contemporary capitalism ensure happy workers and thriving communities? What actions could or should corporations, firms take? And what role do governments and democratic institutions play in this discussion? Today, we have invited 3 guests to have a discussion among each other about these topics, because this series explores new venues, new discourses to think about an alternative for the current broken system of capitalism. Kees Buitendijk, who is the program coordinator finance and the government good at Subsidised, will open the event this evening with a column on behalf of a think tank of young economists. Every evening we have hosted in this series started with a young economist and their perspective on this question, the questions I raised in the introduction. And after that, my co-host David van Overbeek will interview first Isabella Ferreras. And she's a senior tenured fellow of the Belgian National Science Foundation. She is a professor of sociology at the Université Catholique de Louvain, where she teaches at the Department of Social and Political Sciences at the Institut de Sciences de Travail and at the Economics School of Louvain. She's a permanent researcher of CRIDIS, Centre de Recherche Interdisciplinaire Démocratie Institution, Subjectivité. And she has been an associate of the Labour and Work-Life program at Harvard Law School, where she's now a senior research associate. Wow. She is also elected a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences, Humanities and the Arts of Belgium. Quite an astonishing resume for a professor in any time. So we're so honored that she's part of our program. But what we want to talk to her today about also is her latest work, where she wrote a manifesto, Le Manifeste Travail, with a group of other scientists to actually talk about the subject of today, how to to make the workplace more democratic. Then, after that, David will interview Josh Ryan-Collins. He's the head of finance and macroeconomics, senior research fellow at UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and an economist with interest in finance and banking, land and housing, economic rent and climate change. He wrote a few books, but his latest books, Why Can't You Afford a Home, is his most recent one, and we will talk to him about that especially, because that, of course, talks about the relevance of one of the, well, most important things in a thriving life, a house. And after that, these two interviews, we will have a group discussion. And hopefully you will join us and you can put forward questions to these speakers by going to the Zoom webinar. You can find the button for that on the web page of this evening, on the program page at deswijger.nl. And then you can chat with other viewers, but you can ask the Q&A button to ask questions to these guests. Please do so, and we get them here on our desk, and we can post these questions on behalf of you, the viewer. Join us. So that's a lot of information, and hopefully we can add another page to our research we are conducting, this public research we are doing, interviewing these amazing thinkers all over the world on relevant questions to reimagine capitalism. Okay, let's now go to the first, the pitch, the start of this event. Let's go to the column of Kees Buitendijk.
Earlier this year, American economists Anne Kees and Angus Deaton published their book on Deaths of Despair. They signal that life expectancy in the United States, which is the wealthiest country in the world, is falling for the first time in decades. This is mainly due to the rise of suicides, alcohol poisoning and drugs overdoses among white, working-age, middle-class men and women. These men and women are unable to keep up in the contemporary American economy. Europe is different from the United States, many would rightly say. We have better healthcare arrangements, social securities and safety nets. However, the COVID crisis has made clear that many European countries are also on the brink of an age of uncertainty. Private debts, unemployment numbers and income insecurities are shooting up fast. And we have most likely not seen the end of the crisis yet. Expectations are that the worst economic shock is still to come. Ages of uncertainty are no natural phenomena. Both of our guests tonight have pointed out how important institutions, from governments to international corporations and banks, have been drivers of today's growing inequalities and insecurities. And in my opinion, the problem of uncertainty is not only a problem of institutions, but also a problem of underlying worldview and ideals. The American philosopher Michael Sandel has recently written about the tyranny of merit. For many decades, the dominant idea in Western societies has been that the well-being of all individuals would aggregate to the success of the collective. Work hard and educate yourself so you will thrive is the dominant mantra. For some, this has proven to be true. They are the winners of globalization, the haves and the cans. Many others have been unable to live up to this ideal. They are the losers, the have-nots and the can-nots. Our complete worldview, and with it most policies and collective arrangements, is aimed at the strengthening of individual well-being, and with great effect. Our free and democratic Western European societies offer enormous possibilities for individuals. And many of these freedoms are to be cherished. The freedom to express yourself, to choose your education, to travel where you want and work where you like. But it seems that we have come to a point where our ideals are wreaking havoc. We are not dealing with a democratic deficit or a lack of freedom, but with the problem that democracy and freedom do not work for us all. Individuals have won, but collectively we have lost. Liberal democracies in the West therefore face an important question again. How do we combine individual freedoms with collective securities? The security of a steady and meaningful job and a decent home to live in, for instance. In an already famous editorial, the Financial Times stated in April of this year, radical reforms will need to be put on the table, reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades. I agree. The leaders of our institutions, the public and the private elite, will have to step up to prove that democracy, freedom and wealth can work for all. They will have to take responsibility to lay the groundworks for a new social market economy. And maybe it's even time for unorthodox policy measures, like basic incomes, grant new social housing plans and stronger labor laws. The only question is, where and when will new coalitions stand up, of those that are willing to take painful but necessary decisions? Because from the current age of uncertainty, we seem to be able to go 2 ways. Into despair for many, or towards security for most. I hope we will choose wisely. Thank you.
Let's go to my co-host David van Overbeek, who will interview Isabella Ferreras.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Isabella Ferreras, for being here with us tonight. I think a very poignant column by our columnist Kees. He pointed out that democracy and freedom do not work for us all in the current system. Tonight, I'd like to focus on 2 fundamental pillars of a modern life: work and housing. And first, of course, I'd like to explore the workplace with you, Ms. Ferreras. In an essay you wrote in 2019 called Democratizing Firms, you state that leaving the government of firms to capital investors is certainly unreasonable, illegitimate and highly unintelligent. Given the gravity of our current circumstances, labor investors must be brought to the table and put in a position to seriously weigh on the firm's strategies. Why are firms in such a need for democratization, as you mentioned, Ms. Ferreras?
What a great question. Well, first, thank you very much for having me on your program. It seems to be a fantastic program, and I feel very happy to be able to contribute to this collective thinking. The question you raise is obviously at the crux of things today. I think we have all seen and recognized in this pandemic that workers are essential, and even those workers whom we did not recognize, certainly not as essential earlier, and that we considered as occupying very low-skilled occupations, as checkout clerks, garbage grabber, or delivery people. And the thinking here is to recognize that these workers, as obviously those to whom we recognize even more skill, as doctors or lawyers or whoever is working, are actually the human possibility for the economy to exist. And so the important point here is just a very factual understanding that there is no economy, there is no firm without what indeed can be called labor investors. People invest not their money, they invest what's even more important. They invest their person, they invest their body, their mental health, but even their physical health, as we are seeing today in this pandemic, in their work. And even though that investment is massive, it's central, is absolutely crucial for any firm to exist, for any service to be produced or any production to exist, yet workers are left out of the government of the firms to which they contribute. And that is actually, yes, unjust and inefficient.
So what should we do about that?
So because Natasha referred to that op-ed that was extremely popular among the scientific community, an op-ed that we wrote with my colleague Julie Batilana at Harvard and Dominique Méda at Paris Dauphine, and that we really wrote to just try to contribute to our public conversation in order to try to help societies basically get the knowledge about what's going on in this pandemic, or what are the lessons that we could learn. That op-ed circulated to our closest female collaborators first, who signed it, and in 2 weeks, so many of our fellow scientists among the global scientific community actually signed that op-ed. And we affirm a basic principle, which is that workers should actually be able to validate collectively the decisions that apply to them. And that is a philosophical principle that you can tie to the existence of collective bargaining, which was at the turn of the 20th century a huge victory for workers, so that they could affirm their own needs, their own views about what their work should serve, how should they be compensated, all the issues that concern their work life. And indeed, we have to ask ourselves today, how can we deepen that principle in the context of the firm? And I've been working on in that area, and I've been learning a lot from the history of political bicameralism, because what I think is the problem of the firm today is a problem that we know very well in the history of democracy, which is the problem of the despotism of what is actually a minority, but which is generally made of those who own the means, so the property owners. And the history of bicameralism is in the history of democracy, the history of political entities which were faced with the growing demands by the other constituency, if you want, the constituency of those who were the essential contributors to the entity, as in Rome in the 5th century before Christ. As in Rome was governed by the patricians, who monopolized the right to govern Rome. And at some point, the plebs basically said, we're not going to continue to collaborate if we don't have a veto right on these decisions that actually affect us as much as they affect you, the patricians. And the plebs was made of the merchants, the army, so really the essential workers of the entity. And the compromise that was struck was indeed the compromise that the plebs would be able to choose for itself 2 representatives for the plebs, which would be able to veto the decisions of the patricians. And I think we should deepen the governance structure of firms today, because you can actually recognize in the board of the corporation what very much looks like a House of Lords. Yeah. And because the House of Lords was originally made in England by those who owned the lands of England, as today the board members are representing those who own the shares in the corporation. And the question before us is indeed, where is this House of Commons? Where is the representation, the channel for representation of those who invest their labor in the firm, who should be able to ratify collectively the decisions of the firm? What do we do with the profits? Or what is the strategy of the firm? Are we building more plastic toys, or are we switching to more sustainable products? All those questions are questions of relevance for workers, and yet they are out of the possibility to have a say on those questions.
Yes, very clear, Ms. Ferreras. Thank you. So in your book, you draw upon a history of monocameralism, so to speak, as you just mentioned already. You mentioned that a bicameral moment, as you call it, occurs every now and then, especially when the powers that are in charge sense that they will lose this power. I guess that is the analogy you just pointed out with Rome and the Senate over there, because if they don't share that power, they will lose it altogether. Now, in Europe, we already have things which are called, for example, work councils. So how do you distinguish, what is a bicameral firm, just to start with, and how do you distinguish it from, for example, the work council?
I think that actually we can see existing works councils as the prefigurative assembly for that second chamber. Actually, when we read about the history of these works councils in Europe, they were established after World War II as the vehicle for citizenship in the workplace. And if you look at parliamentary debates on these works councils, you will see that some were pushing for these works councils to be first steps toward true citizenship. Yet, actually, they have remained consultative assemblies, which enable workers' representatives elected on union lists to have a conversation with the top management. But they never have reached that level of importance in the corporate structure where they are empowered as the board of the corporation to basically ratify all the decisions or the important decision, the strategy of the firm. And I certainly see those works councils as the building block that actually already exists, even at the European level, and that should be empowered.
So do you believe that we currently live in a bicameral moment, so to speak?
Oh, I certainly think that our societies are in deep rethinking about themselves. It's a deep moment of introspection and of violence for those who are not like me, capable to or able to be in the security of their home and have to go to work and feel anxious about that. As I totally agree with your the Kees Buitendijk, who shared with us his column to start this evening, I totally believe that we are only at the beginning of this crisis. And I think that as we are going to move deeper, these questions are going to be more and more to become more and more relevant, and it is going to be I believe a central question of the years to come.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Ferreras. Thank you for all your answers. We're now going to move on to the next interview of tonight.
Yes, and for that, I'm gonna see whether we can get Mr. Collins into the Zoom, and to do that, I'm gonna use a moment. Yes, and then it's time for the second in-depth interview, and I already introduced him to you, Josh Ryan-Collins. So the floor is yours, David.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Mr. Ryan-Collins, for being here tonight. Can you hear us? We can't hear you, unfortunately.
You have to put on your mic.
Perhaps you have to put on your microphone. Unmute yourself, sir. Yes, there you are.
Perfect. Are you there?
No.
Let's just test it. It's fine. It's live, so that is fine. Can you say something? Oh, that's unfortunate. You actually had to, I'm going to explain to the viewers here in the Netherlands, Mr. Collins, that Ryan-Collins, that you had to speak to a group of central bankers. So that's why you were a bit later, so we couldn't test your Zoom presence. Let's see if you are already, if we can already get your sound.
Hello? Hello?
Yes,
there
perfect.
you are.
So hi again. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the second interview, and that is with Josh Ryan-Collins, as I already mentioned. And the floor is yours, David.
Thank you, Natasha. So now let's start for real. Mr. Ryan-Collins, thank you for being here tonight with us. Professor Collins, when my father was young, he was about my age, he bought a house for about 200,000 guilders, or you could say 85,000 euros. And he paid off his mortgage in less than 10 years. Today, such a scenario is impossible for me and a lot of people from my generation, as our columnist Kees Buitendijk also mentioned. Here in Amsterdam, especially, young people need the financial help of their rich parents to buy a home. Why have housing prices risen so fast over the last few decades?
Thanks. Yes, it's a very good question. There are a number of reasons behind it, and the one you hear most commonly is that it's to do with insufficient supply of new housing. So either the private sector or the government's not building enough homes. Now, this may be the case in certain regions, certain countries at certain times. And it's certainly, I think, the case that there's been insufficient, what one might call affordable housing being created by the public sector. But the broader point I would say is that it's actually a problem not so much of the supply of housing, but for the demand for housing. And my central argument is that the demand for housing has changed over time. Now, whereas in the post-war period, say up to the 1980s or 1990s, people viewed homes essentially as homes, places to live, places to bring up your children, convenient place to get to work. There was a shift in the 80s, possibly a little later in Holland and continental Europe, into viewing housing as a financial asset, as well as a home. And when you view something as a financial asset, your approach to it changes. You start monitoring what happens to it, its price over time. You're prepared to invest more than you would if you're just using something as a consumption good that simply fills a simple purpose of, providing shelter. And the reasons for this change were, political, really. Governments made a decision in Anglo-Saxon economies like the UK, Australia, the US most significantly, that that people, as pressures mounted on the welfare state and the post-Keynesian sort of settlement, that people should have the right to own a home, and that home itself could help provide them with financial security and a source of equity finance that could enable a reduction in that sort of in welfare payments and that post-war social settlement, a weakening of that post-war social settlement, essentially. Now, that was only possible with a deregulation and liberalization of mortgage finance, because without that, not enough people would have been able to afford to buy homes. So this idea of the sort of home owning democracy, this idea that everybody should have the right to privately own their own home with their own bit of land underneath it. That idea was made possible by financial liberalization, particularly, as I said, in the UK and the US. And what happened was banks essentially have turned into real estate lenders. Now, the textbook model of the bank is that it takes money from savers and lends it to businesses, entrepreneurs, for working capital, or for capital investment, which are productive activities, are useful for the economy, supports economic growth. What we've actually had since the 1990s is a big shift in what banks do. Now the majority of bank loans actually support the purchase of existing real estate assets, i.e. homes, properties, domestic residences. Now I say existing because most mortgages do not finance the building of new homes, right? So they're not actually increasing the supply of new homes in the way I think a lot of people think maybe they do, and the way governments talk about mortgage finance. We need more mortgage finance to create more demand to build more homes. Actually, no. Actually, most mortgages simply increase the amount of money flowing into a relatively inelastic or finite supply of housing. Partially, that's also just to do with fundamentals. People want to live in cities near decent jobs, with near nice parks, near nice schools for their kids, with nice areas. And there's a fundamental limit on the amount of places in those areas. But there is this other problem that we've had this decline in affordable housing, and the state, as part of pulling back from that post-war welfare settlement, also pulled back on providing affordable subsidised land and affordable subsidised housing for a large swathe of the population. And social housing and social renting became rather stigmatized over time. And as a result, you just had a big growth in private renting and a decline actually in home ownership and in social housing. So, and the third aspect of this really is the taxation system has also favored homeowners and property owners over renters and other types of tenure. So if you're a private owner of a home, you will not pay any capital gains tax on your house when you sell it. That applies, I think, in almost every single European country. Any other financial asset, when you sell it, if its value's gone up over time, you'll pay capital gains tax. There are various other subsidies as well, subsidies on not paying, offsetting your tax against your mortgage interest payments, inheritance tax breaks. So essentially, all the incentives are towards making the home a financial asset and the financialization of housing, rather than returning to the idea of homes being places to live, consumption goods.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you. So government regulations and asymmetry between renting and home ownership, as well as taxes, tax breaks for home ownership. These have led to the rise of prices of property over time. Now you could say that the 20th century was all about rising home ownership. And yet in the first 2 decades of this century, we've seen a decline in home ownership, while at the same time, the rents in cities go up. Now, arguably, more houses are owned by less people every year, so they become more concentrated in the hands of fewer people. Is home ownership becoming something of a marker of the well-off?
Yes, it is. Increasingly, I would say. what you're seeing is a decline in people, say, under the age of 35, being able to own homes. So there's two dimensions, really. There's a socioeconomic dimension. If you're poorer, you're less likely to be able to afford a deposit to get a home. And if you're younger, you're also less likely to benefit. The exception to that is people, as you said at the beginning, who are lucky enough to have a generous bank of mum and dad to be able to give them a large helping hand with their deposit. And of course, people with that kind of help tend to be better off in the first place. So the whole system that we have is reinforcing wealth inequalities rather than reducing them. And the more it goes on, the bigger those inequalities become, the more polarized our societies will become, and the more economically disenfranchised younger and poorer people will feel. And I don't think that's sustainable, frankly. I think we will have unrest eventually, and it could manifest itself in a variety of undesirable ways. So I think the best course of action is to try and change course earlier rather than later.
So how can we establish a level playing field for example, renting and home ownership? You mentioned there's a certain stigma revolving renting. Would you be more in favor of taxing home ownership, or, for example, to increase rights of tenants who want to rent?
I think you need to do both. You need to essentially make the housing taxation system tenure neutral. So there should be no advantage to you financially whether you own your own home or whether you rent your own home. Or whether it's whether you're in a socially rented house owned by the government or cooperatively owned house or in a community land trust or whatever the vehicle may be. That is absolutely key to the sustainability of the system. And I think as part of that, regulating the financial system so there's less mortgage credit flowing into this inelastic supply of housing is also really important, because the system itself is a bit like a positive feedback cycle. The more credit flows into housing, the higher house prices rise, the more the assets of the banks go up in value, the collateral value of the banks rises, the more confident they become about lending to people, the more people feel under pressure to get onto the housing market, get the first step on the housing ladder so they don't miss out on all of these wealth gains over time. And it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, really, that you end up in this situation of very high inequality, very high household debt. People take on bigger and bigger mortgages. And eventually you will, that will lead to a fall in consumption, because people will be paying more and more of their debt, more interest payments on their debt, and a financial crisis, as we saw in 2008, 2009.
Last question, Mr. Ryan-Collins. If we continue on this course, do you think a collapse of the housing market is realistic within 5 years, for example?
Yes, I do think it's realistic. Whether it will be as severe as we had in 2008, hard to say. But if you look at the historical data, you tend to find you have these cycles, call them credit cycles. I would call them housing credit cycles. And you have these busts that happen about between every 15 to 20 years. And of course, in 5 years' time, we'll be due another one of those. It could be that the COVID pandemic speeds up that process, because you're going to have a collapse. You are having a collapse in people's incomes. So far, house prices have remained fairly stable, but I think that's partially because you've had sort of some strange things going on with people wanting to move out of cities and into places where they've got more space. and that's propped up demand a little bit outside of cities, perhaps. And also you've got rich people actually having more money than they would normally have because they're not allowed to go out and spend it anywhere because of these lockdowns. So some funny things going on there, plus some governments stepped in to support the housing market, certainly in my country. But I think, maybe within 6 months, you'll probably see house prices start to fall as the reality of a sort of permanent loss in people's incomes hits home. And that will be a dangerous time. And we could see falls in house prices then, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Ryan-Collins. Looking forward to discussing this at length during our discussion part.
Thank you.
Yeah, so now it's time to what happens when we bring together two brilliant minds. And that is something we have done already 3 times, and it's amazing what happens if you bring somebody from two hats together in different fields, but still researching, I would say, subjects which are really related. And the relation between the two is, of course, which the person who started this day, the column of Kees, Buitendijk, he said that we live in an age of insecurity. And both of you are mentioning that, right? I mean, on the one hand, people would like to have stable, secure and meaningful jobs. And on the other hand, people want the security or the guarantee that they can have a roof upon their heads, which they can afford. And they are fundamental aspects of human well-being. And both of you are sketching suggestions why it's going wrong. The reason it goes wrong is both also, I think, similar, right? You both mentioned deregulation and financialization as perhaps reasons why this happened. And so that is for me the commonality between your two analyses. And now the question is, what do you think of each other's reasoning? How can we match the two analyses? And also, can we find of measures? Can we come up with measures to actually change the things you sketch? Let's first start by asking you, Ms. Ferreras, to respond to Josh Collins. Ik hoor niks. I'm not hearing Ms.
Can't hear you, unfortunately.
So she has to unmute herself.
Yeah. Can
there
you hear
are.
me?
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Wonderful. Okay. Good evening. Good evening, Josh. First of all.
Hi.
I think there is obviously a fundamental common thread here, which is that these goods that we are speaking about, which is to have a roof, to have a place where to live and to nurture your family, and to be able to contribute to society through your work is actually a right and should not be left to the market. And indeed, the basic point that we are making, not only me, but these people with whom I've been working to produce this last book that you mentioned about work, we affirm that the right to work should not be left to the market, and we should not resort to what the so-called labor market to decide who can be helpful and who is left to wonder how they can be helpful while they would so much want to have a job and while they would so much want to be able to contribute to society. So this is why actually we call for a job guarantee. The specialist for that is the economist, the American economist Pavlina Cherneva, who wrote a very effective and then a bestseller actually book just last June, The Case for a Job Guarantee, where she articulates that project and the very idea is that we should not leave it to the market to decide who has the right to have a job.
Yeah, and of course, Kees Buitendijk also mentioned in his column that he was quoting actually the Financial Times, who said that radical reforms are necessary. And they were even mentioning basic income, right? There is, of course, a difference between guaranteeing income in a basic income and guaranteeing a job. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, basically there would be two differences. The first one is that the project of a job guarantee is really rooted in a reasoning about the importance of having a job and being as a vehicle for contributing to society and feeling useful. So you mentioned I'm a sociologist, and this is very central in our study of the importance of working. It actually gives meaning to people. It gives a sense of their usefulness to others. And it's very central to have a flourishing life, to feel that you are useful. And so the basic income justification does not necessarily resort to that, the importance of inclusion, social inclusion through working. Then there is another difference, which is that our countries, certainly in Europe, we already actually spend tons of money on unemployment schemes. And the idea here is just to leverage that money. So it's not that we're asking the moon or asking that, we mobilize suddenly huge amounts of new money injected into a new program. But what Pavlina is saying is that this money is already spent, but actually is only, if you want, digging holes in which people are feeling even more despair, to make a connection with the book of Angus Deaton and Anne Casey that you mentioned at the beginning, The Death of Despair. And so we should actually mobilize that money, which is already in the hands of the unemployment budgets in our national budgets, so that it's not unemployed people that are so-called activated, but it's that budget which is activated, so that these unemployed people who want, job seekers who want to be able to contribute, can actually participate in programs where they can, based on their skills, based on their needs and willingness to contribute, can develop jobs that are actually not bullshit jobs, important jobs. And we are very interested into an experimentation that has been going on in France, the expérimentation territoire zéro chômeur de longue durée. So basically it means zero long-term unemployed people. And for the last 3 years, there's been a very interesting scheme developed in 10 micro localities, where basically that money that is spent by the public power is activated, so that these unemployed job seekers can participate in programs in which they actively develop those positions for them. And what we know now is that these positions that they produce, that they create in a conversation with all the local, the community, the local leaders, etc., are 40% of these jobs are in the area of care, personal care, care to people, and 40 other percent are in the domain of the care for the planet. So there is a huge demand for people to be, by people to be useful.
Yeah.
And these, when we activate that money, actually enable people to bring the goods that are necessary to each others and to the planet. And so it's a very clear demonstration that the so-called labor market, it's probably not the right device to organize our collective life.
Yeah, I can imagine. Professor Josh Ryan-Collins, Professor Ferreras was mentioning that we shouldn't leave such an important thing as meaningful jobs to the market. You could say that you have the same analysis for housing. You shouldn't leave such an important thing as for housing just to the market. What kind of institutional reforms do we need to research or to think of or to reimagine to be able to reach that point? That housing, a good house, a roof upon your head is not left to the market?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would quite agree with the framing of leaving it to the market.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. So you would say I'm not supposed to frame you, so sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I think there's a slight risk with talking about leaving it to the market, as though the market is somehow, independent of policy decisions, right? You've got the government here, you've got the market over there, they're different spheres. That's not the case. That's a sort of neoclassical economic sort of dream world, where you have people, supply and demand, people buy stuff, that determines the value of it, and actually markets have been and will always be co-created by governments and by the private sector and households and civil societies, and so the housing market and the job market that we've heard about are outcomes of that interaction between government and market. And with the housing market, you thought, in a sense, one could argue the problem has been driven by the state to some extent, because the state has allowed houses, as I said, to become financial assets rather than consumption goods, places to live. So the market, the government has essentially, via, for example, not taxing capital gains on property and wealth gains, and by allowing banks to lend huge amounts of money against these particular assets, has sort of allowed the financialization of housing to take place. So, and has also withdrawn from the provision of affordable housing. All of those things should be reversed, basically. So, in terms of institutional reforms, it's just about creating a better market, really. And I think what we need is a sort of balanced mix of provision of housing. So the state providing some, maybe you can still have some market provided housing, maybe you can have cooperative models of housing. The key thing with housing, I think, is that you separate out the increase in value in land from the price of the house. Okay, so the increase in the value of land over time is the result of many different organizations, the private sector, the public sector, investing in a particular area. So say the government builds a new metro station, the value of the land of all the properties near that metro station is probably going to double or triple over time. Those are economic rents. The owners of the properties near that metro station have done nothing to deserve those rents. They should be taxed. And any form of land appreciation really should be taxed. That would reduce the value of houses, it would reduce the speculative demand for housing that I've been talking about, and enable a much better system. But just to speak to Isabelle's argument, I mean, I entirely agree with the concept of a job guarantee scheme. I personally am more in that camp than in the basic income camp for some of the reasons she's talked about, in the sense that I think a job gives people a sense of dignity in a way that just a handout from the state doesn't. It gives people more of a purpose. So I would be supportive of that going forward. And I think that the challenge really is probably a governance challenge in terms of, how do you make sure that, who decides on the type of job that is provided for people? Should it be central government? Should it be local government? Should it be communities themselves? That all of that stuff, is going to be political. It's going to be subject to political negotiation. The one advantage of the basic income, I guess, is you cut through all of that kind of debate, really. But maybe you need that debate for democratic, reasons.
Yeah. Very clear. Thank you, Professor Ryan-Collins. Another question for you. When you mention financialization, you could say it's not arguably only the expansion of the financial sector or the rise of derivative markets, for example, and securitization, but it's also a mindset, a way of looking at the world in which aspects paramount to human life, such as land, work, and money, are commodified in a certain way. So perhaps if we dive a little bit more deeper under the argument that you just made, would you agree that there's a certain view that we hold on these crucial aspects of human life, land, work, for example, house? What has been the result of that view, and how can we change that with keeping in mind the reforms that you just mentioned?
Well, yeah, I'm a bit reluctant to go down the path of sort of saying it's up to individuals to change their view on these issues. I think, you know, there's a you know, the state has played a key role in, for example, determining how we think about property and land. And in a sense, I think it's up to political leaders to create a new kind of narrative around housing or work, in the case of what Isabelle's been talking about. It's not going to be enough just to say, you know, people need to change their behavior on their own, or the communities need to work this out on their own. You know, there's very strong structural pressures and power imbalances, and you know, these are systematic problems. They're not sort of small, marginal problems. You know, so a narrative around affordable housing should I think focus on, you know, even if you're lucky enough to own a home and you've enjoyed all these wealth gains over the last 30 years, what about your children and your grandchildren? What are they going to do? They're never going to be able to live in the way that you've lived unless you sell your house and become much, much poorer. You know, that's the kind of narrative we want, and a narrative around, you know, what one might call deserved wealth as opposed to undeserved wealth, like these land rents I've just been talking about. Which, you know, increases in house prices don't actually benefit the economy. Actually, in a macroeconomic sense, all they do is essentially increase the debt burden on people and increase people's sort of overheads, leaving them less money for consumption or investment. So that's the sort of narrative I think we need to approach.
But then you could, of course, make the parallel that maybe we could advocate for a right to a guaranteed house, like the right to a guaranteed job.
Sure. Yeah. I think, you know, housing should be seen as a right, but not just any housing. You know, good quality housing. And I think the United Nations envoy on this has been making that case. Yeah,
constantly. She was here. Yeah. Housing as a human right. Really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So the narrative is quite similar and nice. Yeah. I see Professor Ferreras wants to respond.
Yes. Just to contribute to the conversation, indeed, it's, I think, fundamental that we remind ourselves that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was signed after World War II really tried to encapsulate the knowledge, the lessons that the nations at the time thought that they should actually learn from the tragedy of Second World War. And among these principles were indeed to consider the right to have a house and the right to work as human rights, as fundamental rights. And I think that it's fair to say that we have organized our economic system around a very different principle. And this is what I meant, obviously, by resorting to the market. So just to respond to the point Josh was making, indeed, it would be unfortunate if people understood when I say to resort or to let to the market, be it having a job or having a house. I don't, of course, imply that the market exists by itself, and it's really probably one of the distinctive contributions of social sciences, which is to keep highlighting that the institution of the market is man-made and obviously encapsulates all the norms that we give to ourselves as societies. But of course, these norms that we give to ourselves are dependent on the power relationships that shape these norms. And so this is certainly this era now that we are entering into is a moment where we should all read again The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi, who had that deep thinking about the society, the market society, as he called it. That book was published in 1944, and it was really a reflection about how Germany basically fell into the arms of Hitler as how he called it, a way to protect itself from the violence of the market. And Polanyi highlighted the fact that a market society indeed deals with labor, deals with money, and deals with land as fictitious commodities, as he calls them. And there is something fundamentally, at least unstable, and obviously unjust to deal with these principles of a good life for every one of us through the vehicle of the market as like the distribution mechanism for these so important goods. So it speaks certainly for the importance of the crisis in which we have entered, that we are capable today to have these types of conversation, and that they feel more or less relevant.
Yes.
I guess.
We've got many questions from the audience. And Evelien Verhagen already asked this question when you were interviewed by David. And she asks you, so Professor Ferreras, would you agree? Do you agree with Colin Meyer? You haven't seen him, but we interviewed him. That the empowerment you mentioned, for instance, in propagating these workers' rights or bicameralism, that should be enforced by law. And if so, what role of the EU can be expected there? And what are the chances that such a law will surpass, given the issues pointed by the current crisis we're in? So do you need institutional reform or even laws to actually make this happen? And what are the chances for that?
Obviously, we do need institutional reforms at every stage of, I would say, emancipatory stages. At some point, you need the state to guarantee new rights to those who were kept out of these rights. So it doesn't mean that we cannot start the work of enacting these rights before there is a consensus at the level of the state or at the level of the European Union to enforce these rights. And so by that, I mean that certainly innovative businesses today are actually thinking about this seriously, and some should start to innovate. But indeed, it will only go through new gains in terms of rights, as in the history of emancipation, if you look at the history of democracy, because my thinking is really in the perspective that we are here speaking about the deepening of the democratic project into the economy. And if you look at how the democratic project has evolved just inside the political realm, it has been through stages of expansion, if you might say, of rights being recognized. Let's take the case of women. First, women were out of the kept out of the right to be treated as an equal, obviously, in the political realm. And at some point, indeed, that right is recognized also to women. Well, at some point, it will have to be recognized to workers that they also have the right to be treated as equal in dignity and rights in the economy itself, meaning to grant them the right to govern their workplace with those who are today granted those rights, which are only the property owners, the shareholders in the firm.
Yeah, I hope this answers Vincent Raumaat's question to you about whether you are in favor of grassroots capitalism or governmental capitalism. Both can be called democratic, his suggestion was, but I'm going to leave it for now. A question for Professor Josh Ryan-Collins from, I don't see from who, but the person who's asking the question says that after the crisis in 2008, a lot of private firms, equity firms, bought the foreclosed houses and actually created a new problem, an extra big problem for affordable housing. What should we do to prevent that from happening in this crisis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that policymakers should be thinking quite radically about how to deal with people who are facing negative equity or facing defaults on their mortgages or simply unable to afford their rents, because it's looking pretty bad at the moment. So one option, I think, would be for the creation of what you might call, a public housing bank or a public land bank, and the role of this sort of institution, or you could call it a housing corporation, but the fundamental role would be to offer to essentially buy out a proportion of the property price of that individual who is struggling to meet either their mortgage payments or their rents, and that corporation would essentially take a equity stake in the value of the property, equivalent to the land underneath that property, and that would enable that would reduce they would take on some of the mortgage payments and the rent potentially as well, and enable that person to continue to live there until they were in a better financial situation. I think that could be a way of not only creating more affordable housing, but of preventing the kind of more serious economic collapse that we almost had post 2008. Now, in many countries, you have these big housing corporations having a much bigger role in the land market in particular. For example, in Singapore, 90% of the land is actually owned by the government. It's not very well known. Singapore's seen as this low tax haven state where companies don't pay any tax. Well, actually, they get most of their tax from the increase in land value over time, and they tax that. Similarly, Korea, a lot of development is done by a housing corporation there. So I think we should be thinking about that sort of approach, where essentially you, as I said, disconnect the value of the land from the property itself. I think it'll be challenging to do that, but I think it's going to be a much better solution. And as I said, the focus should be on the creation of affordable housing rather than simply private firms buying up property at fire sale rates and then letting it out as posh flats, which doesn't actually help families and people who need homes.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. In Amsterdam, of course, it's the same situation as in Korea or Singapore. The land is owned by the government. Let's join at our table now. Kees Buitendijk joined us, who kickstarted the conversation. The two professors through the video conferencing through Zoom have discussed many of the aspects you mentioned in your column. This last 5 minutes, we would like to reflect upon that. Please, what did you hear?
Oh, I heard a lot, and I think we could go on for another few hours.
Oh, yeah, for sure. With these two minds, yes.
Yeah. No, there are. I'm especially interested to talk a bit more about the current crisis, which was mentioned a few times by both of our guests, because I think we have a short-term problem, so to say, and a long-term problem. And short-term and long-term are connected in a way. I think that we are now in the short term seeing that there is a sharp trade-off between what I have called individual success and collective well-being. Professor Ferreras already pointed this out, that we have a sharp divide between so-called safe and unsafe jobs, for instance. What Ryan-Collins said is that already before the crisis, we were seeing a similar problem in housing.
Yeah, insider-outsider problems.
Yeah, safe and unsafe housing, to stay in the same comparison. So we have now, on the short term, very clear the trade-off between the individual promise of success and the collective macroeconomic well-being, and we can clearly see that the problems are severe. So for the short term, it would of course be a question how to solve this, and how to do so in a way that on the long term we will all benefit. To say something, because I think in regard to the long term, what we have also seen in the current crisis is that we can think and act collectively. COVID has shown that we can be strong communities.
There's a lot of public trust in the government measures all over Europe.
And that was exactly my thought, that across Europe, at least, we can see that we are living in high trust societies. We are still living in high trust societies. We trust our government, and we can, well, look after each other. There was already research 25 years ago by Robert Putnam and Francis Fukuyama. But it will be the question for us how to reestablish or how to strengthen this trust in our societies so that we can also on a long-term benefit.
Yeah, clear. Are there already examples, according to you, in European policies where you can see that governments are actually thinking about that? Do you think?
Well, I think what both our guests also pointed out, that the question for security and the question for equality are clearly on the table again.
Yeah.
And I think security and equality are prerequisites for
You could even say
trust.
that all the corona or COVID measures from the government by guaranteeing incomes all over Europe is part of the acknowledgement that that is a very important aspect of the quality of life.
Yeah. And I also agree with both the speakers that it is not a question for government alone, building trust. It is a question for
all institutions of society,
institutions,
right?
for banks, for corporations, for pension funds, for many of the central institutions of our societies.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm looking at the clock, and I think it's almost disrespectful to ask people from the other side of the world to answer in 30 seconds the last give the last comments. But let's see if there is one reflection you would like to give to us, hearing this reflection from Kees Buitendijk. Professor Ferreras.
Maybe I would like to mention the fact that again today in The Guardian there was a news report that Swiss Re, which is the big insurance firm in Switzerland, so it's not a leftist group, has actually forecast that 1/5 of the world's countries are at risk of their ecosystems actually collapsing because of the destruction of wildlife and their habitats. And so I think my only regret is that we've not been able to talk more about that, because it's entirely connected to both our concerns vis-a-vis work, labor, and vis-a-vis having the right to have a place where to live.
Yeah. Clear. It's all over. It's all out there. Same question to you in a few seconds, Professor Josh Ryan-Collins. What would you like to add?
Yes, thanks. Yes, I thought the point about COVID and sort of the opportunity for people to have more trust in governments, I'm not sure it applies to every European country in quite the same way. I'd say maybe the UK might be an exception there. But I think looking back on history, the Second World War, certainly in my country, led to the creation of some of the most important institutions, particularly National Health Service, that, make the country what it is today. And I suppose that offers a glimmer of hope, actually, that if this crisis continues to be as serious as it appears it will be, maybe political leaders will take that opportunity to create new kinds of institutions to deal with the problems that myself and Isabelle have been discussing.
Clear. Thank you so much. Thank you for your participation in this online consultation of brilliant minds. Next week, we'll be back with the next edition, and Elizabeth Anderson and François Bourguignon are there on the role of free markets in increasing inequality. Thank you, all viewers, for watching and participating and asking all these questions. And I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you so much.